Pure Search hosted our breakfast forum on the great wealth transfer and how this will be changing the risk landscape. This was moderated by Shaun Lynch, so we're just going to discuss some of the key points. Welcome, Shaun. Thanks again, Shaun, for this morning. It was really appreciated, you moderating the forum for us. One of the key discussion points we had was the shift to alternative asset classes and what that might mean for the industry. I don't know if you'd be able to provide a bit more insight into what the results of the forum were on that.
Sure, thanks, James. It was a very interesting discussion focusing on sort of the great wealth transfer and potentially between now and 2050 about £5 trillion pounds of assets in the UK transferring from one generation to the next. I think one of the interesting parts of that discussion was what do we mean by that transfer and what do we mean by the new investment demands of that next generation. And we're not necessarily talking about 20 to 30 year olds. One of the interesting elements of the conversation was the actual demographic. We're often talking about assets being transferred to people in their 50s. So whilst the conversation focused on the demand for alternative assets, whether that be private equity, private debt, and the challenges of putting those assets on a wealth management platform, the interesting demographic point was that there are assets which are going to be leaving the wealth management industry as those who inherit or take those assets over seek to cash out to help their children, for example, buy UK property and pay down mortgages. So that was a bit of an unexpected conversation element. On the one hand, there are demands for new assets, professionally risk managed with appropriate yield, but also significant challenge in terms of maintaining assets in order to help children.
Yeah, and you mentioned there around sort of the move to technology slightly. There was an element, which was our second point, around the creation of the digital bank and how that would impact the industry. Were there any key points that came out of that side of the discussion?
I think what was very interesting about that is a real tension in terms of the demands of clients for ease of access and, for example, portfolio reporting. One of the contributors mentioned, they update the app for iPad use much more than they do any others because that's how the clients access their portfolios. But the tension between ease of access and reporting, as well as having to maintain a very rigorous structure to mitigate operational risk, cybersecurity concerns, and so on. So that, I think, is one of the main themes of wealth management risk, is going to be managing some of those technology risks. We also touched upon usefully on AI and the fact that a lot of wealth managers are concerned about the use of AI by their suppliers, right? And the potential risks that place within their business without them even really being conscious of it at this stage. That was a very interesting discussion, all about the tension between the demands of the clients, ease of access, tech platform as a USP for a wealth manager, but the operational cybersecurity AI risks associated with that.
Yeah, and a nice part of that discussion as well. We also touched upon some of the big players in the tech world coming into the industry, such as Amazon and Apple. I don't know if you'd be able to provide a bit of insight into what the results of that discussion were.
Yeah, there was an interesting point, right? Because on the one hand, there is an increased importance on technology and having a very sophisticated platform. But at the same time, we discussed that wealth management, and I don't think it was complacency on the part of the wealth management participants, but wealth management does have its own barriers to entry, given that you're dealing with sophisticated investors in a whole series of jurisdictions with quite complex regulatory tax and reporting requirements. I think the discussion focused on how the market segmentation may evolve in the wealth management industry, where you've got middle market players with very sophisticated platform, complemented by maybe smaller players servicing high net worth clients. But it's clearly something that's on the agenda as banks, wealth managers increasingly become sort of IT companies in and of themselves.
Yeah, and of course that leads on to our final point of discussion, which is around wealth as a service and the changes that will come from the industry. Again, I don't know if you could highlight some key points that came from the transition into that world.
Once again, that conversation was linked to the dynamic that exists between client service and technology. And one of the contributors used a very good turn of phrase saying the challenge is to find where the human fits into the loop. Ultimately, wealth management and private banking are relationship businesses dealing with people's personal wealth. There needs to be a human component to it. Just where does that human being, where does that wealth management professional slot in to the client journey, as it were, right? And I think everyone agreed that, in terms of maybe day-to-day flow queries and, basic processes such as account opening, there wasn't going to be the need for human intervention, as has traditionally been the case. But ultimately, people want the phone number, they want to have a relationship manager who can help them with problems and who can be that trusted advisor. So I think whilst technology is a key opportunity and challenge for the industry, ultimately private banking is about relationships, and it's a very human enterprise.
Yeah, of course. And ultimately the discussion was centered around great wealth transfer, how this is changing the risk landscape, and talking around the future. So from a conclusion, what would you say are the key takeaways from how the great wealth transfer will impact the risk landscape moving forwards?
I think some of the key takeaways focused on investment assets, the challenge of finding new pools of value for clients, which also have implications for wealth management platforms, i.e. booking private assets, for example. And then the whole notion of technology, investment in technology, technology as a USP for a wealth manager. And then those challenges may have implications for consolidation in the industry. As I mentioned earlier, you may see a larger cohort of middle market players complemented by sort of more traditional pure play banks that serve family offices and ultra high net worth. So that will be an interesting thing to see how a marketplace which has been traditionally quite disparate, how that begins to consolidate, and whether there'll be a disrupting force, as you outlined, maybe from one of the large technology players.
Great. Well, thanks again for your moderation, Shaun. Really much appreciated. And we look forward to speaking to you soon.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, James.